Yep. Um, so I'm a bit of a boomer here. I can't figure out how to share on this.
So hopefully, I'll do your
Here it
intro really
is.
quick
I got it.
because I've made an intro and I'll do a bio really quick and then we'll have you share. So let's get started. We've made it to the end of term symposium. Again, I'm incredibly excited about this. There is no way in normal non-COVID times we would ever be able to get this group of guests. Honestly, it's kind of my number one choices. My three top choices all said yes. So we're going to start with Nikki King. She's presently the manager of addiction services and behavioral health at Margaret Mary Health in Batesville, Indiana. At 1:30, Chuck Corra and John Isner, the co-hosts of Appodlachia, are going to be joining us, followed by best-selling author Silas House. And finally, to cap things off, we'll hear from representatives from Central College's Appalachian Advocacy Union. So I'm very excited to introduce my first guest, Nikki King, MHSA, who's currently the manager of behavioral health and addictions at Margaret Mary Health in Batesville, Indiana, as well as the founder of the Court Addictions and Drug Services program, founded in October of 2018. So Nikki was born and raised in the coal fields of southeastern Kentucky. Prior to working in healthcare, she worked for the Center of Business and Economic Research, studying models of sustainability in rural communities with a single economic engine, like coal. She has been working at Margaret Mary Health since 2015, occupying roles in clinical statistics, as well as currently managing the Behavioral Health and Addiction Services Department. In addition to her role at Margaret Mary, Nikki is also pursuing a doctoral degree in healthcare administration from the Medical University of South Carolina, where she's currently researching the efficacy of criminal justice and healthcare collaboratives. She currently serves on the Indiana Rural Health Association's Board of Governors, the American Hospital Association's Opioid Stewardship Advisory Group, the National Rural Health Association's Policy Congress, the Conditions of Confinement Advisory Committee, and as the board chair of Rural Health Leadership, of the Rural Health Leadership Radio Board of Directors. Nikki, we're thrilled to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys. No, I'm going to figure this out. I can do this. Aha!
All right.
I'm so good at this. I'm so proud of myself. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Rockin'. All right. I never doubted for a second I could do this. Okay, so hi everybody. I'm Nikki. You've heard who I am. Also, if you've read the Atlantic article, then you know more about me than I ever intended to share in a public audience. So I guess I'll just skip right through that. I started the Serenity program with my team back in October 2018, formerly called CADS. We're just rebranding as we expand and we take on more different kinds of patients. So the program has really grown since 2018, and now we work a lot with moms in particular, but folks who are involved with the Department of Children's Services, as well as now having a pretty significant following of voluntary folks who just presented treatment. So we came up with a name that did not include court for those reasons. The Serenity program is actually really linked to our history at Margaret Mary. We had an inpatient substance use program back when the nuns were in the hospital that was called Serenity Hall, and it had a really good reputation, and it was really ahead of its time as well. So even though that program closed long before anybody who's working there now was there, we really kind of wanted to do a callback to that when we were picking a name. So we have grown. We now have 4 different locations that are in 2 different counties, and we're going into a third one really soon. We have grown to 10 providers and subsequent support staff. This is a picture of Batesville. That little yellow building there is like a 200-year-old inn. It looks like something out of the Shire on the inside. It's amazing. So success metrics. when we really set out to look at this program, what we really wanted to do is talk about what does success look like, and it can't just be people stop using drugs. I mean, yeah, that's great, but we had a lot of philosophical discussions as a team. What do we think substance use is? And ultimately, what we landed on is that, and I will back up with data later in this presentation, substance abuse is really a response to trauma. It's a lack of coping mechanisms. We do not believe in substance use disorder as a standalone mental illness or a standalone diagnosis. If there has ever been somebody who has substance use disorder who did not have an untreated depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, etc. before it, I've never seen it. And I would be very skeptical if anybody even told me it existed. So when you start looking at things like widespread cultural trauma, widespread child abuse, different things like that, as well as poverty and systemic social inequalities, that's when you create a situation that is, for lack of a better word, untenable for the people who live in it, and they start to find alternative coping mechanisms, most of which are ones that you will not like. So in order to fix that and to really have long-term sustainable success, we determined that we really believe the secret sauce to this is to make people's lives kind of worth living. And so it's not really just about getting them to not use drugs. Then it becomes an issue of how do you fix the system? How do you give somebody a basic quality of life and then give them the coping mechanisms that they don't have to go back to substances in order to deal with their lives? And so our success metrics that we come up with that we really wanted to grade ourselves by at the beginning was obviously overdose rates, overdose deaths. I mean, that's pretty cut and dry. I think everybody pretty much monitors that. But we also wanted to really look at food insecurity reduction. We wanted to look at how do we get these people back to work or engaged in education? How do we get them to go back and get their GED or to move along to their college education? Housing insecurity and domestic violence. A lot of times in rural communities, you run into a lot of multi-generational poverty. So you have a lot of people who are living in the same house, 2 and 3 generations of people. They're all abusing substances together. There's a lot of toxicity, a lot of domestic abuse and things like that. And breaking them out of that cycle becomes pretty paramount to actually getting them into a healthier lifestyle. We also wanted to look at how do you engage them with a primary care provider on a regular basis. And, some of this goes to doctor shopping, of course, how do you get them to stop going to the ER and trying to get medications and things like that? And how do you get them engaged with one provider who can really be the point person on everything that's going on with their health care and help to coordinate all this, which is really the role of a primary care physician. And also, how do you then reduce improper ER utilization? So some of this goes to the doctor shopping, but some of this also goes to people don't often understand the role of a family doctor in their healthcare. That's not something that we talk about a lot as a culture. If you're healthy, why do you need a doctor? Especially in rural communities where so many people don't have insurance or their insurance plans just suck. You know what I mean? What is the point of seeing a doctor if you don't absolutely have to? And so when they get sick, they just go to the ER because, Ricky's there. I love Ricky. You know what I mean? Like Doc Collins, he's been there forever. You just go see him and you don't think anything of it. You know what I mean? And there's never, we don't talk about what the proper way to utilize an ER is as a culture. So how do we change that? You know what I mean? How do we have those kinds of discussions and that kind of education and helping people understand when is a good time to go to the ER and when should you have a primary care provider that you can just call up and be like, actually, I have an earache. Can you just write me an antibiotic? So we wanted to have those discussions as well as all the standard mental health quality metrics. So some of those are things like something called a PHQ-9, which is a depression screening. It just helps grade how depressed you are. Not perfect, but obviously you want to see decreases in those scores. Otherwise, you're probably not doing a whole lot in treatment. Decreases in GAD-7, which is another metric score for anxiety, things like that. So when we got into the program and we started getting some results back, we started getting some pretty stellar results. And then that's when, the Atlantic article and all that sort of came to be. We have had 0 overdose deaths for the entirety of the program, which we're incredibly proud of, and that is a metric that, you know, really I think makes this program stand apart. Um, and I hope on a personal level really leads credence to the argument that substance use disorders are really a systemic issue, because addressing it as a systemic approach has had pretty wild success rates. We've had 1 overdose, unfortunately, and that was 2 weeks ago. Otherwise, we would have had none. We were running 0 and 0 for a long time, but fortunately, the pandemic and the election has put a lot of people on the edge. The acuity of patients that we're seeing since the pandemic started is extremely high. Rural suicide rates have just gone off the charts high. Rural suicide rates were already, as a whole, much higher than urban suicide rates, and we're seeing those rates in some places as much as double. So we're having a really hard time keeping a lid on it, just going to be honest with you guys. But luckily, it was not a fatal overdose. So, you know, live to fight another day. We've seen 85% reduction in food insecurity, which is a huge, huge number. Part of this is actually, believe it or not, when we first started the program, I figured there would be a little bit of food insecurity. I dramatically underestimated how much food insecurity existed in rural communities. Our very first day in the program, it is and I'll talk a little bit more about the program design, but it includes 9 hours of therapy a week, 3 3-hour sessions. And in that group, I thought to myself, I've had a couple of 3-hour college sessions. I was in a coma by the end of it. So, like, how do you keep people engaged so that they're still getting something from that amount of treatment? And what I ended up thinking was, well, I can at least try some snacks, right? So I went out and I bought some veggie trays because we're a hospital and we're supposed to be teaching health, right? So I got all these healthy snacks, and we're going to, you know, try to kind of put away the Mountain Dew and the Cheetos for a bit. And it worked, but what I did not expect was for them to jump all over it. And a lot of them admitted that they had not had food in several days and they didn't have food at home, etc. And so then we're like, oh crap, you know, how do you engage people who are hungry? You don't. So I went out in the middle of the group and I bought a bunch of groceries and I sent it home with everyone. But obviously that wasn't going to be a long-term solution. And so we ended up partnering with the Food and Growers Association up here, which is the folks who do like the farmers markets. So right now, what we do is actually we get boxes of produce that are seconds. So either stuff that maybe didn't sell at the farmers market or isn't quite pretty enough to be sold at Kroger, but it's still good, you know, just not pretty. And our dietitians actually do cooking classes once a week and teach them how to cook really simple meals with it. We give everybody the little burners and skillets and cooking utensils at the beginning with a grant that we got. And so, you know, we really try to focus those classes on really easy to cook stuff that you don't need a lot of things for and that also a kid will eat. You know, it sounds really funny, but you can look up a lot of these recipes for the vegetables and stuff that we have. And it's like, oh, sure, just julienne this piece of chicken. I'm like, I don't even know what that is. And then, you know, or it's got some kind of weird sauce that no kid is going to eat. And so they just don't cook it. So trying to find things that are, you know, obtainable and realistic for people. And in doing so, we've actually, like I said, we've had an 85% reduction in food insecurity. And not only is that food insecurity, but that's, you know, that's healthy stuff. That's produce and vegetables, and it's all locally sourced to try to minimize the impact on the environment, as well as to bolster the local farmers who are independent farmers who are really struggling to compete with, you know, big industry farmers. And so that program actually has created 5 local farming jobs that we're pretty excited about as well. So 90% increase in workforce engagement. Of course, we knew people needed to have a job. They were just getting out of jail. They had a criminal record for substance use, which can make it very difficult to get a job and to get back re-engaged in the workforce. So one of the things that we ended up doing was, you know, I reached out to the unemployment office or Indiana Work One for help. And they basically were kind of like, well, you know, we don't really have the staff for that. I'm like, yeah, but I have like a group of 12 people that you can knock out at once, or we can send them all out there. You know what I mean? That doesn't make any sense. And so we talked about it from a logistics standpoint and found out that we can actually have somebody come out and meet with our group as a whole and teach them things like resume building skills, give them a list of all the open positions, teach them how to interview. We've got a grant for stipends for uniforms, so like steel toe boots and things like that, because we were having a lot of folks who were getting jobs, like in the factories or the farms, but they couldn't start because they didn't have steel toe boots and they couldn't afford the boots because they didn't have the job. So, um, getting help with things like that, as well as women who have struggled to participate in the workforce, getting, daycare waivers and things like that through the state. Those are extremely difficult to sign up for. And so getting people to sit down with them and help them figure out how to sign up for that. We had no significant decrease in housing security. That one pains me to put. We don't have a homeless shelter. We don't have, all we have is a domestic violence shelter, which serves 10 different counties. Um, the wait list is gigantic, and it's only for women. And so we had veterans sleeping in tents. It was bananas. We were trying to put people up in hotels. They were sleeping in cars. It has been chaos. We have now finally found a partner to partner with, to provide some residential treatment and some housing, and we're looking at sober living housing. So hopefully this gets better because it's been terrible for 3 years. This has definitely been the part that makes you want to run your head to the wall. Um, we ended up seeing a 40% increase in primary care attribution, so people who followed up with their primary care physicians, and that led to about a $1,200 decrease in ER utilization costs per person, over the course of the 3 years. Still working to get that number up, and some of that is just because honestly we don't have enough physicians in general in the community, so the wait lists are pretty significant. But yeah, we've had 75 patients served to date, and that's actually a little bit older number. It's actually probably closer to 100 now. So, what is this program design that we talk so much about? Honestly, the reason I don't put that up front is because it's constantly changing. Constantly. There is no one set design. I remember one time we had an issue and I made the comment back to the drawing board, and one person on my staff was like, "Oh God, we live at the drawing board." And so I kind of liked it. So now we say that all the time. But, when we first started, for example, we had no idea about the food insecurity issue. Not that it was that bad. Like I said, I knew there was a little. And now that's a huge feature in our program is our partnership with the FDA and everything we've been able to do from that. I like to think that, well, heck, like I said, right now we're in the midst of partnering with a residential and sober living provider. So I like to think that there's always something that we can add. There's a new treatment type that we can add, etc. But the general outline right now, hopefully, is that a person will either be referred from getting out of jail or from the Department of Children's Services, or they'll call. Um, if they are actively detoxing, so they've been using and they're dope sick, then we have partners that can help get them into detox and then into a 30-day residential program where they will come back into the Serenity program. Or they might be able to go straight into the Serenity program if they've already had some clean time or depending on the substances that they've used. Um, but the general program lasts anywhere from 6 months to a year. It's a heavy lift. But we work really hard for those for those success metrics, but our patients work a lot harder. So, you know, um, partnerships with the community is absolutely the biggest part of this. We are a very small hospital, so we're a standalone hospital in a town with 6,000 people in it. 25-bed hospital, not part of a system. Um, Medicaid doesn't pay you a lot. I know that might shock everyone, and that's for the ones who actually have insurance. So, in order to be able to offer all these amenities that you offer in commercial paid programs in California and Florida and things like that, we really can't afford to just pay people to do this. So, we really rely on volunteer and like organizations in our community, like again, like Work One and the unemployment office and the FGA really stepping up to bat and helping us out here, because if we had to pay for it all out of pocket, it'd be a shadow of the program that it is right now. So this is my plug for networking. Every time I talk to students, I'm an introvert. I absolutely hate talking to people. I do math for a living. I don't know if that tells you guys about how cool I am not. Um, I don't think I have friends outside of video games or Dungeons and Dragons. So, I mean, when I say I'm a loser, I want you to understand what I mean when I say I hate networking. But it absolutely was the single biggest thing that built this program, you know. And if you absolutely hate talking to people like I do, then just talk to them long enough to figure out what they can do for you and how they can help your patients. That's all you got to do. And then just keep it in a little mental Rolodex and someday call it back up. Um, People told me that a lot in school, and I didn't believe them because they were all people who like to talk to people for fun. But even if you don't like to talk to people for fun, you might need that someday to help people. So now let's get on to the Appalachian stuff. I just want to get that out of the way. A lot of you guys have already read The Atlantic. I know I flew through that, but I really wanted to talk a lot more about the Appalachian stuff. So if you guys have any more questions or a really in-depth, interest in what the clinical side of things look like, I'd love to talk to you about that. Heck, I'll invite you up to come. If you sign some paperwork, we might even be able to get you set through some of the sessions so you can see the program firsthand. If you're interested in becoming a clinician, etc. Also, we're looking for interns. So, but how do we get here? So this is Wattsburg. I've heard that there was a lot of debate. I don't know where Wattsburg came from, other than a really hardline interpretation of my accent. But yeah, Wattsburg, Letcher County, Kentucky. On the other side is Hammond, which is where I grew up, which is very close to Neon. I lived there until I was 10 years old and a house burnt down, and then moved to Awesome, but still very much identify with Hammond back alley. So yeah, this is where I grew up. I want to talk about the war on poverty. So from here on out, some of this stuff is research based, and obviously I'll tell you when it's research based, and some of it's just kind of my take on things. So, take it with a grain of salt. It's complicated being an Appalachian, I think. And so I want to talk about the war on poverty. Spoiler alert, we lost the war on poverty real bad. And so this is a picture of when Lyndon B. Johnson came to Inez, Kentucky, which is about a little over an hour from where I grew up. And he met with the Tucker family on their farm and their house, and he talked about the poverty. Most of the federal programs in this country came right after this picture. People were shocked when they saw what was going on in Appalachia. A lot of them couldn't believe that Americans lived this way. And so the Appalachian Regional Commission was born. There were things like food stamps born from this. A lot of good came out of this, and so much bad that we just don't talk about. Because, in a single picture, I feel like they told the world what to think about Appalachia. This is all we are. We're poor and we have dirt floors. You know what I mean? And I think that this is particularly problematic in America because you would hope that enlightened minds would see this and realize that this is a result of several systemic injustices. And this is a call to action. How do we help this region? But how many people really look at it like that? Because my big concern is that the American dream, this concept of the American dream, that you work really hard, you make it in life, and that you get rich, is so ingrained into the American psyche and a lot of people somehow have made the really weird unconscious jump that goodness and hard work and success are intertwined. And so when you see things like this, the cognitive dissonance comes in that there must be something wrong with these people, or they wouldn't live like this. They must be lazy, or they must be addicted to drugs, or, they're trashy for, like, you know what I mean? And just like that, the Appalachian accent stopped being cute and it started being dumb. And poverty that took hundreds of years to make is suddenly reduced to a single opioid epidemic now. And it is so not that simple. But on the other hand, like I said, this is really complex, right? How do you talk about this issue? You know what I mean? How do you talk about the very real systemic injustices that exist today in Appalachia without also painting people with the same brush that they have seen Appalachia under since this picture came out? I have no idea. That's a rhetorical question. But why is Appalachia so poor? There's a lot of reasons, but this is one that I don't think gets talked about a lot. Mineral rights. So when you look at people who moved into the Appalachian region at the beginning, I mean, depending on which area you're from, they could have been several different kinds of immigrants. The particular area I'm from is really heavily Scots-Irish. These were people who a lot of times were not wanted in the cities. They didn't have enough money to make it in the cities. They came over penniless. They moved out into, at the time, what was the new frontier, and they staked a homestead, and they were farmers. Well, the problem with that is later when, around the time of Carnegie and they understood the Bessemer process and learning how to make steel, when they found out that there was coal in Kentucky, a lot of the coal was being tied up in these homesteads. And so they came up with the idea that you could sell the mineral rights without owning the land. So these people who had been homesteading for years thought they owned their farm. And then all of a sudden, a coal company comes in and they bought the mineral rights out from under the farm. And the way this works is they can just tear your farm all to hell and take all your coal, and then you can't farm it, but then arguably you still own the land. And so that saw the creation of the coal camps. And the coal camps originally they popped up as a way to support the mining industry's workers. And they were bringing in workers by the droves to work in these coal mines. But the problem is now the homesteaders' farms who have been tore up really don't have any other options. And so they move into these coal camps. And it's boom and bust from there. Coal is really complicated and it's really hard to talk about. I think a lot of people assume that Appalachians must really hate coal because it's completely wrecked the region, and I feel like that's a really reductive view of it. It's much more complex and nuanced than that. Because the thing is yeah, selling the mineral rights did create a lot of poverty in the region. It kicked a lot of these people off the homesteads and in a lot of ways subverted what was normal progress for every other rural region in the country. However, the coal camps were also really nice and people wanted to live there, which is weird. These are pictures. So the top one is another picture of Hammond again, and the bottom one I think is Pikeville originally. They created a lot of houses that were much nicer than the ones were there, and they were very comparable to a modern day middle class suburb. They had theaters, they had bowling alleys, they had nice churches, they had nice schools that were all paid for by the coal companies. People got paid in script instead of money. And so that was problematic because they actually did get a good salary as a coal miner. A lot of them made a really decent living, but it was in script that was only redeemable at that coal camp instead of actual dollars, which is all great and fine until the coal camp doesn't exist and you have no capital because you don't own your house because you're renting it from the coal company with script that you were getting paid to work there. So now you've lost your job, you have no savings. All of the money that you had is not good anymore because it's almost like you had a currency from a country that no longer exists. And so when the coal companies left, in their theft basically was these camps that just started to decline because people, how do you go out and start a new business? Okay, the coal company leaves, the theater goes with them because the coal company owned the theater. How do you get the capital to start a theater? Even if you were the person who ran the theater, you don't own your house, so you can't take out a loan against your house. You have no savings because they're all in script. And so you get stuck in this never-ending cycle. And so, in a way, the coal companies were the only reason Appalachia had nice things. On the other hand, they took all the nice things away and they took the carpet up after them. So now we can't have nice things again. So it's a very complicated and nuanced situation. The problem being is that with a lot of people in Appalachia look back to these golden days and say, if coal was here, we would still have these things. Our parents had these things. You can see the skeleton of these things where they used to exist and they no longer exist. And so it creates this really weird thing where nobody loves the coal mines. A lot of people have had their house destroyed by coal mines. They've lost a loved one in the coal mines. They know our water's polluted because of the coal mines. They know our air's polluted because of the coal mines. But poverty is a bummer. And nobody wants to be poor either. And those are your choices. You know what I mean? You go back to the war on poverty house, or you can live in a suburb and everything's poison. I mean, those are your options. And so I think that this is really important when we talk about Appalachia today because it has to be a big part of the solution, is understanding a really confusing relationship with coal. It's like an abusive relationship, The coal companies come back and things are good and you think your relationship's amazing, and then things get bad again and you just tell yourself it won't happen again. And it does. All right. mental and physical health in Appalachia. So this is another huge issue. A lot of these things existed in a lot of populations that, settled the United States, but most of them worked themselves out with time because life got better for most people in the US. Unfortunately, in Appalachia, life has stayed pretty comparably the same to when the immigrants came over, so it did not get better. Things like multi-generational trauma, multi-generational violence, multi-generational substance abuse have been going on forever. So Appalachians have a 66% higher rate of work injury than most comparable communities, and that's because mining is not a lot of fun. And the other industry is logging, which also creates a lot of injuries. And the other industry, besides that, is the military, which also creates a lot of injuries. High rates of military recruitment across the board. Appalachians on the whole have a 5-year shorter life expectancy, and that's due to higher rates of autoimmune disease, higher rates of cancer, different things that are actually related to the pollution and the water from the coal mines. And now we're back into this again. Or maybe it's the poverty, or maybe when the coal mines go out, the water gets better, but the poverty gets worse, and now everybody's got cancer. Or maybe everybody got cancer and that made them poor, and then the coal mines went out. And so you get stuck in this like never ending cycle. Suicide rates in Appalachia are 17% higher than the rest of the nation. Most mental illnesses exist at a rate that's higher than the rest of the nation in Appalachia. Some of that is likely related to genetics. And again, going back to that multi-generational trauma, some of that is related to the current events and just the miry pit of things that are going wrong. Regardless, the mental health situation is extreme. And so that is the backdrop for the opioid epidemic. And so you hear a lot of, Oxyana in West Virginia, you hear a lot of, Oxycontin being called hillbilly heroin. I remember somebody once told me colloquially that Purdue Pharma spent more money marketing Oxycontin to this area, to the coal fields in central Appalachia, than they did the entire state of New York. They had predatory marketing practices where they had identified that there was a much higher rate of chronic pain here. And we can argue all day whether or not they truly believe that people who had legitimate pain could not become addicted, which is the message that they were telling doctors at the time. Regardless, all of the things that are significant risk factors for developing substance use disorder existed in spades. And all the things that later would become the foundation of the CADS program and later the Serenity program when we existed, it was, in my mind, a way to sort of unravel some of these things that started really at the base. And so that's where I come in. This is where I grew up. This is Whitesburg. This is me and my papa. And this is Walmart. I don't really know. I mean, these pictures are from the Atlantic article. So if you guys read the Atlantic article, you've seen them. I don't really know why Walmart was the picture that they went with, but I do love that Walmart. In all fairness, they have like everything, so it's fun, I guess. So this is really where I grew up, and so I was born in 1991. So as I was growing up, this was happening. This was just starting to happen. And the story, I talk about being at my best friend's birthday party when I found her mom, overdosed in the bathroom. But the thing is, I barely remember a time before drugs were part of our consciousness. It was definitely when I was little. And I slowly remember it becoming a more and more dangerous place, or at least the perception that it was. Something that we used to do is we'd leave the keys in the car in Heyman because somebody might need to borrow your car and your neighbors didn't have your car. They have a car and you don't want them to have to wake you up. They could have an emergency. In fact, one of our neighbors had a son who was a hemophiliac and they have a car. So we would leave our keys in the ignition of the car at night in case they needed to take him to the hospital. And, now that's completely unfathomable in our community. Now you're lucky if the tires are still under your car when you come out in the morning, whether or not the keys are there. And that was such a rapid decline that was largely related to the rise of substance use disorders and subsequently cutting people off. Because then once we figured out that it was addictive, we started cutting people off cold turkey, which created a whole other host of issues. But, I think really the really interesting thing for me was when I got to UK and for the first time I realized it's actually not normal that everyone uses drugs. I kind of thought that's where America was. I didn't realize that was one of those specific Appalachian things. Like, growing up, it was really interesting that we would have certain friends that, you can go to their house, and you have certain friends that, must come to your house and that you can never go to their house. And it's this unspoken truth of the why that exists. And then you get to college and realize most people don't do that. Most people have a pretty similar upbringing. And so it's this really complicated situation for me because I I go through these wild oscillations of loving and hating Appalachia because I just can't figure out where to land on it. But regardless, um, that served as, the inspiration for this program. There was never a point in my life that I thought that this was undoable from a treatment standpoint. I remember looking around in the classroom and thinking, I know you're going to be on drugs and you're going to be on drugs and you're going to be on drugs. And everybody talks about what they're going to be when they grow up. And you think, right. For the vast majority of them. And now I look back at that and I'm so appalled because I think as a child, I could see who is at risk. How have we not done anything about it as a country? How are we letting 14-year-olds out sleuth all these billion-dollar agencies that we throw money at so that they can bring solutions to Appalachia that worked great at a silver mine town out in Colorado? We just can't figure out why it's not working in Appalachia. Oh, well, we got these two people that are great success stories for our $6 billion investment. I just can't figure out why it's not working. It's probably the Appalachian people. And so I really have struggled with that. And I, in a large way, wanted to prove that it was possible. And it was every bit as simple as I had been saying it was from the beginning. Everyone kept saying that it was impossible. Once people get on drugs, they'll never get off. And that was coming from a place of people going through drug treatment programs that just told them repeatedly to stop doing drugs instead of looking at the social issues that led to them choosing that path in the first place. Because, y'all, I don't know how to tell you this, but if you think anybody logically looks at somebody who's struggling with a methamphetamine addiction and think, that's what I want to be when I grow up. I want to be just like them. Like, no, nobody ever thinks that. So something went wrong between that 14-year-old I sat in the class with who told me that they wanted to be a teacher, and I thought to myself, right, and the methamphetamine addict that just completed their 16th consecutive jail sentence. Something went terribly wrong, and that is our call to action as a society is in that gap. How do we get to that gap? I don't care what it costs. You know what I mean? Because ultimately, the human life benefit exceeds. But it doesn't have to be expensive. It just has to be intuitive, which is what I really wanted to prove with their program. And I think I made my point, going back to the success metrics and the fact that we're talking today is, point heard. I remember the year before we started CADS, we sat down with Senator Todd Young from up here in Indiana. And he was sitting down with a bunch of healthcare leaders and he said, all right, so realistically, there's no way from a state standpoint we're going to be able to afford to do treatment in every community. So what we really need to be talking about is how to build affordable pathways to get people from rural communities into Indianapolis for treatment. And I'm like, what? No. And so I told him, I'm like, well, I'll make you a bet. I'll bet you $5 that within a year, I will have a program that's as successful as anything that you have in Indianapolis. And long story short, I'm charging interest, so he better send me that $5. We met up once, and he actually tried to give me the $5, but he didn't have change, but I'm still charging interest. So, yeah. I think the biggest takeaway from this is community partnerships. One of the big inspirations that I had for the CADS program is when you go to these public conferences, they always talk about what we don't have in rural communities over and over again. It's what we don't have. We're very poor. Everyone's on Medicaid. There's no billing. There's no transportation. There's no this program, no that program. Almost nobody ever talks about what we do have, which is we have a lot of people who are invested in a small group of people. So, for example, even though we're a 25-bed hospital, we actually serve a community of 65,000 people, most of which do not go anywhere else for healthcare. They go entirely to Margaret Mary because nothing else is really drivable unless it's an emergency, like, super special brain tumor kind of cancer. But in a city like Lexington, you might have 4 or 5 hospitals that are serving the same people, and they'll never know. if that patient is their patient or somebody else's patient. When they call 911, they're going to go to whatever hospital the paramedic likes. And that's it. Anybody in our community that we serve, they call 911, they're coming to Margaret Mary. And if you're in Whitesburg, you're going to ARH in Whitesburg, period. I mean, that's it. And so in rural communities, we have a population. We have a dedicated population of people that rely on us. And so you have partnerships in that community that are there to leverage that, because these are our people. They're not some people. They're not people you'll never meet on the street. They are people that you know. And you might be related to them. You're probably related to them, honestly. And so it's very important that we look at it from that standpoint, because our program, a lot of people say to me, how do you afford to do such a robust program and still serve the Medicaid and uninsured population? I'm like, I don't pay for anything. I have like 3 people that staff this entire program, because the rest of it is done by volunteers and donations and different things. Like, our staff at our program are some of the most trained. Like, we met with an Ivy League university hospital lately, and they're like, your staff is more trained than ours. And I'm like, yeah, because I get people in the community to donate money to pay for it. I don't pay for it. You know what I mean? And one of our clinicians wants to go to a $2,000 certification training, and I make a couple phone calls and the money appears, and because people want to see us be successful and they want to be invested. And again, because this is their community, and that's something that's just very unique from urban communities. And we don't talk about that as a resource. And how do you harness that human element nearly as much as we should in the conversation about rural communities, or the ability of rural communities to create their own solutions to problems versus having these pre-packaged solutions brought in from urban communities that are then mini-sized and poorly fitted. So let's talk about the Appalachian brain drain and hillbilly elegy. Spoiler alert, I absolutely hate hillbilly elegy. I hate it so much I can't stand it. And it's really funny though, because in a lot of ways I get painted with the same brush, and I get it. And I don't even think people are wrong for doing it. I don't know how to talk about being Appalachian. I have no idea. How do you talk about the issues without the issues being all that there are? How do you address the things that are wrong and get the right attention and get more resources without poverty porn? I have no idea. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know the right kind of press. But I can tell you the one thing, for example, hillbilly elegy in general, I actually thought that it was a very good story, and honestly, it was kind of triggering in situations because it was so spot on. I'd lived a lot of the things that he had talked about. But personally, my personal opinion, I hate the notion that we can bootstrap our way out of this, because it's just not true. I get a lot of people who talk about, oh, why were you successful? What was different about you? Absolutely nothing. I'm not outstanding in my field in any way. I got lucky. I got lucky so much. For starters, let's talk about like being white was wildly beneficial to me in so many different aspects of my life. I have benefited from white privilege, and I know that. I have benefited from being kind of bright academically. If I hadn't got labeled with that early on in school, I would have been left behind. But, you kind of get in these small communities, you get labeled as a smart kid, and then everybody wants to see you keep being the smart kid, and they're invested in that. And so when you don't turn in your homework, the teacher doesn't give you a 0 because they know you're a good kid. They'll let you turn it in next week. And different things like that just pile up. I had teachers take more time and invest in me because they thought I was going to be successful. You know what I mean? They felt like they saw something in me, and they would take the time to tutor me or to talk to me about college when I did not see them do that with my classmates who were from those families. I have benefited from that in 1,000 different ways. I really reject some of the things he says in there. Like, like for example, one of the lines he talks about people in Appalachia buying iPads and name brand clothes when they're poor. Those have been well documented phenomena across every impoverished population. And I don't know how to tell him this, but when you live on $16,000 a year, no amount of saving is going to buy you a house. So you might as well just go ahead and get that shirt from the Gap and live it up. It's just, that's just it. And I get really disappointed because I feel like, again, when you go back to this conversation about cognitive dissonance and how America feels about work ethic, it becomes very easy to say Nikki worked her way out of this situation. Look how brave she was. She snuck out and went to college when she was 17. Look how all the stuff that she did. And I did work hard, and it was scary, and I didn't know about any of that stuff. But I think the better question is, why did I have to? Why is that the like bare minimum that it takes to survive, is pushing yourself to the point of insanity? Like, it should be easier, and the fact that it's not is a condemnation on how hard it is to be Appalachian. And so I don't know. Like I said, I kind of I, I do feel like I contributed to the brain drain. I also don't know how to not do that. You know what I mean? So like, for example, I'm on a first name basis with most of the politicians in Indiana. When I want a piece of legislation passed, I can probably do it in 3 phone calls. I have been trying to get Hal Rogers to return my email for like 4 years. I you know what I mean? So what do I do? Do I go home and hope for the best? Do I stay here and keep doing what works? I have no idea. It's a completely rhetorical question. I did contribute to the brain drain, though. I know I did. I'm yet another person who left. Do I go back and I fight these fights to fix it? Or do I try to fix it from another angle, from another level? Can you put out a burning house from the inside, or do you have to be outside of it? I literally don't know. Again, that's a rhetorical question. So and I think that it's pretty central to the Appalachian story that you even have to answer those questions. You know what I mean? Because you don't hear somebody else from Cincinnati being like, why don't you just go back home to Cincinnati and solve poverty? Why do you do this? Why do you work with disadvantaged children in San Francisco when you're from Cincinnati? You should have went back to Cincinnati and did this program. Nobody ever answers those questions when you're not Appalachian. And so I don't know. But anyway, that's my story. Uh I'm open to questions. That's my works cited page. It's a train wreck. I'll do a better one. I forgot to finish it. Forgive me. I work at a hospital during a pandemic.
So we got a question from Lauren Skidmore.
Okay, first of all, I want to say that I was absolutely captivated for all of that. I was like sitting here leaning closer into my laptop the whole time. You speak so eloquently, but so understandable, and I really, really loved that. So many things I could say about everything, as far as just how accurately I really thought you talked about a lot of different things about Appalachia. Loved it. But secondly, in your article in The Atlantic, you kind of mentioned that you were too young and too female to provide solutions in Appalachia. And I'm not gonna lie, I didn't look at the date that the article was published, but do you still feel like that's true? Or do you feel like you could go into Whitesburg or anywhere in Appalachia, and kind of help get one of these programs started? Do you feel like you could use your voice in that way now, or do you feel like there's too much of a stigma still?
Um, I really still feel like there's a lot of stigma. I hope I'm wrong. I went to a Rural Health Association meeting, and it was kind of funny because I was talking to a guy who was a CEO of one of the local hospitals, and I was kind of talking about our program, and he's like, wow. He's like, you're an awful little girl to be doing something like that, to be taking something like that on. I'm like, okay. And so, I run into a little of that, and honestly, I've this is gonna sound terrible, but I feel like now one of the bigger issues is, I'm finally, I'm pushing up against 30. I'm finally kind of getting to an age where somebody might take me seriously. And now I've been painted with the liberal brush and nobody wants to take me seriously. So I don't know. I feel like people have been pushed to rage at such a point with even just the coal discussion. At such a point of desperation, it's very hard to have a discussion that doesn't immediately turn into cynicism because so many things have failed. And I don't know. I would be open to try. I'm definitely getting a lot more like movement. I talked to um, Governor Bashir's office quite a bit now, and I'm definitely getting a lot more movement there than I had. But we'll see.
Kylie Short raised her hand.
Hi, Nikki. So what's actually funny is I read this article and then I asked my dad, I was like, Dad, do you know her grandfather? And he was like, oh yeah, like we go up there all the time to like get stuff done. So that was kind of funny. That's so Appalachian and so Whitesburg of us. But my first question, I have two questions if you don't mind.
Yeah.
My first question is, when you read the article that the Atlantic published on you, did you like it? And like, how did you feel about it? And then I'll ask your other question after you answer that one.
Torn. I guess I like the article, and I don't know. I mean, I knew most of the things that were going to be in there. I knew what Beth was going to report on. And again, this kind of comes back to that central question. How do you talk about the problems without the problems being that's all there is? How do you talk about the problems without poverty porn? And so for that, I think the article was probably about as good as it could have been for what it was. But again, this comes back to the central issue that I don't know how we can get to a place where we can talk directly about the struggles in the community without getting painted with the hillbilly brush. I don't know.
It definitely is hard. I see that. And then we also talked about in class, like, how it's hard to have people come into Appalachia and tell a story about it without it being someone, who's from there who's writing it. So that definitely adds another layer of it being difficult. My other question was, so I'm getting ready to go to law school, and every time I have to like write an application, like, what makes you diverse? Like, why would you be a unique applicant? It's always the Appalachia thing that keeps coming up. And so like you were saying, they're like, okay, what do you want to do after you graduate law school? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, do I need to go back? And so what I was going to ask you is, when you graduated, do you feel like your experiences in Appalachia really led you to do what you're doing? And like, would you feel fulfilled if you were doing something else? Because I know that from my experience, like, you learn so much about poverty and about like healthcare and a lot of other really challenging issues while you're living in Appalachia. And to me, it would be pretty hard to not do something in my career that deals with those things. So I was wondering if you felt the same way.
Yeah, like I said, I've had such a hot and cold relationship with Appalachia. I get so frustrated when people fight policies that are for their best interest. And I'm like, oh my God, you know what? You made your bed, lay in it. And then the next day I'm like, no, they didn't. You know what I mean? And so I go back and forth. So long story short, when I graduated, I spent some time studying economic research, and I helped write a lot of policies that were supposed to bring about $10 million of relief to Whitesburg, and they voted it down. And after that, I'm like, you know what? Screw you guys. I'm never coming back here. I'm going to do my thing. I'm going to be happy. I'm going to live somewhere sunny. It's going to be great. And then, when I started working at Margaret Mary, I actually had full intentions of going back into economic research. I actually did not intend to go into healthcare management at all. And one of the things that they charged me with doing was statistics for the hospital and creating these dashboards of our frequent flyer patients. So people who are repeatedly coming back to the ER. And what I kept seeing was the same pattern that I had seen when I grew up in Appalachia, which is they don't have transportation. This is an old person who's lonely. They can't get anywhere. So they're calling 911 to take them to the hospital, because I'd seen that. Or this is someone who is pill shopping, and they're coming back to the ER over and over again, telling them whatever they think is going to get them some Norco or whatever. And everyone just looked at me mystified. And I guess I just took it for granted that everyone doesn't know that stuff. And so then the more I started into it, the more I'm like, how do you guys not see this? How does this not make sense? And then it turns into I'll just do it myself. And so that's kind of where I'm at. And I have a feeling that no matter where I go, it's always going to come back there. Something tells me that. Yeah. Appalachia's not done with me.
Thank you. That was a great answer. And as an Appalachian, I'm really proud of you. You've done a lot of really great work.
Thank you.
That's a wonderful segue. We're going to have to wind down. But speaking of Appalachia, one thing I'm going to have to bring up here is that you almost went to Center College. So you got in, your best friend didn't. I think that was a huge mistake on Center's part, not accepting your best friend. I think you would have been alum. So we're going to have to rectify that post-COVID. I'm inviting you now to come to Center to give a convocation.
Okay.
So hopefully that's something you'll be able to do. And also in terms of students that want to get in touch with you, is your email address a good address they could use to contact you about internships? Okay, so I'll also circulate your email address.
Awesome.
But this was really, really cool. You put a ton of work into the slideshow. I almost feel bad because I just gave you a huge list of topics and you literally hit on all of them. So except for before I forget, where's Kenny? Kenny was such a figure.
Yeah, Kenny's doing fantastic. So he's a regional manager at McDonald's now. So it's so funny because we get a lot of people who like go through the drive-through or whatever, and they're like, they're like, it's like freaking Alaska out here, because he said it in the documentary and everybody thought it was really funny when they put that little clip in there when he goes outside and it's cold and he's like, what are you talking about? It's like 90 degrees. And they're like, from the video, oh yeah. So it actually just really creeps him out, but he's doing really good. He's doing fantastic. We still talk all the time.
Wonderful. So yeah, I'll get students. I'm sure we'll get a ton of emails of students interested in taking part. And this was a terrific presentation. You really went above and beyond here, so I really appreciate it.
No, thank you guys for having me.
So you're welcome to stick around, but we'll need you to undo the screen share. But you're
I can definitely do that.
To stick around if you have time. So
yeah, I'm definitely not going to steal my own thunder here by not knowing how to stop this.
So
that's so good.
Chuck and Big John, our next symposium participants. Thank you so much for joining me, gentlemen.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's a terrific, just incredibly excited about the lineup of speakers. So our next speakers are Chuck, Corra, and Big John Isner. So I'm assuming you use Big John to differentiate yourself from the tennis player of the same name.
Oh my gosh. Yes. For years I've had to deal with that. So it's nice to have something, even though he's way taller than me. But I got to go with something to differentiate.
So I feel like he was in the world's longest ever tennis match, right?
He was. Okay. Yeah.
And I think that got fictionalized by like Kit Harington. I remember they made a movie about it.
Yeah.
It went on like 3 days.
It was insane. And that's probably the first time my Twitter blew up. People thinking that was me, which I took full credit for.
So now you need the moniker Big to kind of differentiate yourself a bit.
Exactly.
So Chuck and John are co-founders and co-hosts of the podcast Appalachia. There we go. Which seeks to provide a counter narrative to the negative portrayal and harmful stereotypes of Appalachia portrayed in the mainstream media. So Chuck is the son of a union steelworker and a native of Parkersburg, West Virginia, who spent the first 22 years of his life in the Mountain State, cementing his love for all things West Virginia and Appalachia. He earned his JD from Michigan State College of Law, where he also taught the First Amendment to high school students. After law school, Chuck moved to Nashville and spent several years working on progressive advocacy and public affairs campaigns throughout all parts of Tennessee, from Memphis to Mountain City, and helped advise local political campaigns in Tennessee and West Virginia. So moving on to John. John is a native of Parkersburg, West Virginia as well. Raised by a single mother, John learned early what it meant to struggle with poverty. After earning his JD from the West Virginia University College of Law, John moved to the Eastern Panhandle of West Virginia, where he ran for office and taught political science at his alma mater, Shepherd University. Now, John has returned to his hometown of Parkersburg with his wife, Taylor, and their two dogs, Bosley and Bonnie. He works in a community development project. She works in community development and project administration. And I should mention that Chuck currently lives in Northern Virginia with his wife, Kristen. So thank you so much for joining me, gentlemen. This was the best graphic I could get. So y'all both grew up together, I guess, in Parkersburg. Was that kind of the dynamic?
We've known each other since high school.
Okay.
We met in newspaper class.
Oh wow.
So journalism real early on.
Yeah, we got to know each other because we were college roommates. I was a senior. John was a sophomore at Shepherd, and I was an RA that happened to have a lot larger apartment. So John and I roomed together there, and kind of grew our friendship from that, and haven't lost touch since.
So, could you give me a sense of where the idea for this podcast came from, when you decided it was time to launch?
Sure. So the way, John, why don't you start? Because the way that you put it is pretty good about your campaign and everything.
Sometimes I say a couple good things. This I guess is one of them. When I ran for office, Chuck was, I don't know if you'd call him like a campaign manager because he was so far away in Nashville, but he helped me create dialogue, and the whole time we were talking about issues and it was resonating with a lot of people, but obviously we were just in this little kind of neck of the woods in West Virginia. And once the election was over, we didn't want to stop talking about it, because these were issues that didn't just go away because I didn't win an election. There's still issues every single day. And so Chuck and I would spend hours talking about these, and we thought, okay, just for our own, I guess, self-interest, why don't we put some microphones in front of our faces and talk about these issues so everybody can hear them?
Yeah, total vanity project, 100. Yeah, well, and I'd agree with you. I think we're also just tired of people talking shit about West Virginia, and particularly about the region of Appalachia in general. And we noticed in the podcast space, while there are, God, like tens of thousands of them, we didn't really notice many shows that were really talking about what we wanted to talk about from the frame of reference that we had, about people living in Appalachia who maybe represent different views politically, culturally, otherwise, than what's generally portrayed in the media. And so we wanted to try to be that voice. And we, when we started out, that was just our plan. We kind of did this in a very amateur sort of way, and didn't really have like any startup money or anything like that. We did it just scraping from the barrel. And so we just came up with an idea. And that was really the basis for it, is that so much of the conversation around Appalachia, and especially West Virginia, is negative. It's talks about like all the bad things about it, and all these, horrible stereotypes that have been harmful to the region for decades. And so what we wanted to do is just provide a counter narrative to that.
So I'm going to start with a really big question. The really big political story, I would argue, of 2020, 2021 is Georgia going blue. Georgia sending 2 Democrats to the Senate, Georgia being carried for Joe Biden. Do you think it could happen in Appalachia? I mean, you have this framing of Appalachia as Trump country, but you do have, this tradition of, at the very least, social progressives like Robert Byrd. Do you think, and you two are sort of, I guess, would be more in the progressive camp. Do you think something like what happened in Georgia is plausible for a state like West Virginia?
I mean, I can start just with like one example. John is more deeply connected to the politics there, being from there, but one of the conversations that we had recently was with a member of the Martinsburg City Council. Martinsburg is a city in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia, young, progressive, Black, 21-year-old guy who ran for a council seat and won. So certain things like that, you can see like progressives starting to win at the local level. And I think that that's really where movements start. Georgia, the thing about Georgia is it didn't flip overnight. That was decades of work of painstaking grassroots organizing that took place in the backs of people's yards, on people's porches, like neighbors talking to neighbors, that kind of thing. Those things that don't get headlines, but that are meaningful over time. And I think that the 2020 election was just finally like there was enough water to overflow over the dam with that. And West Virginia, the thing is that, in my opinion, I think that needs to happen too. And I think you're starting to see it at the local level. I mean, West Virginia elected their first openly transgender elected official this past cycle, Rosemary Ketchum in Wheeling, West Virginia. John may agree with me, may beg to differ, but I think the statewide level I don't see it changing a lot in the near future, but I think much like Georgia, what West Virginia needs is sustained investment in grassroots organizing and people starting to build power at the local level in order to actually make change at the statewide level.
Yeah, we've talked about this a few times, and I guess I'll narrow it down to Democrats versus Republicans. I don't believe that Appalachia is conservative or liberal. If you looked at the history of Appalachia, it tends to sway whichever the country has gone. So, for instance, West Virginia was controlled by Democrats for 80 years. But now it has this reputation that it's this super conservative place. And to me, it's because people like Donald Trump were able to capture the narrative. They controlled the narrative all across Appalachia. They were able to invest in Appalachia. And now you have progressive people at the top, Democrats at the top, who say, we can't win Appalachia. Screw it. We're not going to invest there. We're going to move on and try and win these other ones that we think are flip seats. And that tends to be why Appalachia stays the way it is currently. But you saw in Georgia what investment and what time will do. It will change people's minds. I believe full force, and this, I've knocked on 2,000, 3,000 doors talking to people, and a lot of them didn't want to talk to me at first. But there is this belief that you can't change someone's mind. And some people that's true, but for a lot of people, if you talk to them like an actual human being and not throw political jargon at them all the time, they're willing to come around and see your side of things. They may not agree in the end, but at least you can have a conversation. And that conversation is what starts the ball rolling. And I think that's what Georgia did really well.
And John, your election was proof of that too. I mean, like, you didn't win, but the margin of difference between you and the last Democrats that ran in that district was, what do we say it was, like 17 points or something like that?
Yeah, it was a substantial change.
Yeah, and I think we had a Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio on our show right before the Christmas break, and I think he summed it up pretty well when it came to the party split. He said that Republicans do nothing for Appalachia, and Democrats, quite frankly, don't do enough for it, and don't make themselves known for what they do. And I think that that's another big problem there. Like John said, the branding issue is huge. I mean, Democrats as a brand is just terrible there. But it's also important to remember that Appalachia itself is a 13-state region that stretches clear from the basically the Mississippi Delta up to upstate New York. So you have like just a broad geographic diversity there, in addition to a political diversity.
Yeah, you can think of it in terms of Appalachia as plural as opposed to. So I mean, when we're talking about West Virginia and Kentucky, we're largely talking about Central Appalachia. I guess you can kind of parse out the region even further than what's on the map. So sticking with politics, given the 50-50 split in the United States Senate, one of the senators who is likely to get the most attention, get a substantial amount of attention for at least the next 2 years is Senator Joe Manchin, a Democrat from West Virginia. Do you think the sort of leverage that Manchin has right now in the Senate, being a very important swing vote in the Senate that's basically split down the middle, do you think that will bring attention to issues in West Virginia? And it's now a good time for activists within West Virginia to mobilize, given the attention that is bound to follow Manchin?
I'll start with that one. I worked pretty closely with Joe Manchin's campaign when I ran in 2018. He helped in a lot of ways try to get me elected. Now, we didn't always see eye to eye on politics, but Joe Manchin is one of the most unique politicians when it comes to anybody who's ever been a member of the U.S. Senate, because party politics, if you look at his voting record, I mean, he doesn't care. It's one of those things that he's more willing to, I always tell anybody who wants to know how to talk to Joe Manchin, if you can actually pull on Joe Manchin's heartstrings, you might get something out of him. But he is a politician to his core. That man knows how to win elections. That's how, and so he's going to continue to do the things that he knows will win elections. And one of those things is to include West Virginia in a lot of bills that he may not normally approve. And that's what I think you're going to see a lot of over these next 2 years, is he's going to use his role in the Senate to essentially just create line items for the state of West Virginia, which, if you remember back in the day, Senator Byrd he was a magician at that. That's how West Virginia, our alma mater, Shepherd University, half the university is named after him or his wife. So he was able to do that to, to the very best. And Joe Manchin is very good at it too, but now he finally has the power to do it.
So you've probably already seen this, but there's a Wikipedia page for things in the state of West Virginia that are named after Robert Byrd. And
Yeah.
honestly, if I were to have printed that out,
Hell, half the
if I were to have printed
surprised
that
they
out, it
haven't
would have been
even
at least 20
seen it.
pages. Like, it's incredible just how branded, the entire state is with the name Robert Byrd. So
Yeah.
something, sorry, Chuck, did you?
Oh, no, I was just saying that's why they called him the king of pork.
Yeah.
So something you mentioned is changing the cultural narrative. And I've noticed one of the most prolific pieces of content that you've done as part of the podcast was a 3-part takedown of, I guess, the book, now the movie, Hillbilly Elegy. And what is it you think about narratives like Hillbilly Elegy, which was a best-selling book, now kind of a Ron Howard produced, big time director, film with big time, Amy Adams, Glenn Close. What is it about narratives like that? Do you think that appeals to people outside of the region?
Yeah. Well, to answer your last question real quick, if Joe Manchin's smart, he will take the newfound attention that he has and direct it towards West Virginia. We'll see if he does that. But I think that, John and I love talking about this because it's something that that I think every Appalachian has an opinion about. Well, I think you just said it too. I mean, the power of it is that Ron Howard produced it into a movie, and the movie largely doesn't talk about the things that in the book that Appalachians object to, about the way that he characterizes poor people, about the way that he characterizes people where he's from, and Appalachians in general. And I think that's, it's a large part of the problem. J.D. Vance was given a huge platform with this book, and it came out at essentially a perfect time for that book to come out. It came out right before the 2016 election, I believe. I want to say it was in May, and it really got popular afterwards and was kind of looked at it as this spiritual tome for how to communicate to Trump voters in Appalachia for whatever reason. But the thing that really bothered us is that there was these broad sweeping generalizations that characterize the entire book. But the coverage of the book was broad sweeping generalizations about how great it was and how instructive it was and how this is how you communicate to these people. Like for whatever reason, you need a manual to communicate to people where we're from. I don't know why that would ever be the case. But I think the biggest objection that John and I had to it is it didn't tell the story of Appalachia. It told the story of one person. But the way that the book was written is it was written in a way as if he was telling the story of a people and not of a person. And I don't remember.
Memoir of a culture in crisis. I think memoir of a family and a culture in crisis. So right there.
Absolutely. And I think that was our biggest issue with it. And what we did, which is not what a lot of other people did, was like, John and I both went through the book painstakingly, like earmarking everything that we found interesting, I guess I'll put it that way. And we went through and deconstructed how he has framed the narrative of Appalachia and how his worldview and what broad sweeping generalizations he took away from his experience there and uses that to cast everything in that light. I think that was our problem. And I'll stop after this, but the biggest thing is that this just reinforces a lot of the negative stereotypes and perceptions of Appalachia that have been around for decades. And it was yet another example of that given major limelight and now greenlit into a Hollywood movie.
So you've both at this point read the book, went through the book with a fine-tooth comb, and also I would imagine you've seen the movie as well?
No,
Okay.
I've refused to watch the movie.
Same way.
And you mentioned earlier, I think it was in the last question, you said, why do people essentially enjoy it? It's a best-selling book, right? The reason they enjoy it is because it literally complements their stereotypes. People don't like to be challenged in the way that they think. So if they can read something that they agree with, they're going to enjoy it. So if you have outside the region of Appalachia who are reading this and thinking, yep, I know all about these hillbillies. I know exactly what they do. They're a bunch of rednecks that are racist and lazy. J.D. Vance literally opens it up opens the book up by this story of this guy that goes to the bathroom too much, and he equates that to all Appalachians because they're lazy and all they do is spend hours in the bathroom. They don't want to work, and then they blame people for firing them. And then when people read that, they go, you know what? I heard that. I heard that somewhere else too. Yeah, and people love to be confirmed, and that's why they love that book.
Yeah, that book really hits with the Potomac Watch columnist of the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, it does.
So this came up in our last talk with Nikki King, who's done a lot of work in addictions treatment out in Indiana. She's from Appalachia. But we talked about how difficult it is to tell authentic Appalachian stories that are honest about the challenges facing the region without crossing that line into poverty porn, or what we might call poverty porn. How do y'all navigate that problem in your storytelling?
We let people tell their own story. And that's where poverty porn comes into play, right? Like JD Vance, his story is not the story of Appalachia, right? And that's why we equate it to poverty porn, is because he says, okay, my story is Appalachia and my view is, how you should view Appalachians. But we as a show decided, okay, it's only right for Chuck and I to tell our own stories. It is not right for us to look at other people and tell their stories. So part of the reason we created this podcast is to essentially say, hey, you can now come on here and you can talk about your struggles. You can talk about the good things and the bad things that you face in Appalachia. We're not going to do it for you. And that's really, I think, the key difference between this line of poverty porn and telling someone's story. You got to let them tell it. You got to let them tell their own story.
Yeah. And, we also don't sugarcoat things either. I think we make a concerted effort not to do that. We're not ignorant to the fact that there are a lot of struggles where we're from in Appalachian. We talk about that in our own stories. I mean, one of the episodes we did recently was about Appalachian identity, and it's a very complicated subject to talk about, especially for us. And like when I spoke about it, like I was not proud of where I was from when I grew up, because I believed that where I was from was lesser. I was made to believe that it wasn't a place that you'd want to stick around in. I was made to believe that it's a place that you need to get out of, but like you have to get good grades, you have to go to good school so you can get out of West Virginia. And so it's something where like we also struggle with our own perception of it. And that's just the thing, is like we can speak for ourselves. We let our guests speak for themselves, excuse me. But the biggest problem, like we said about Hillbilly Elegy, is it's taking one person's singular experience growing up and making broad sweeping generalizations based on that one singular experience about an entire region of the country and of its people.
So one last question for both of you, and then I'll open it up to my students. Memorable guest for you, Chuck, and memorable guest for you, John.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, I think like all of them have been very memorable. I guess for me, the most memorable for me was when we had Sherrod Brown on, because I've been following Sherrod Brown for a really long time. I think he is a politician that is not like other politicians. He knows how to speak to the working class, and because I had a personal connection to that, he when he first ran for Senate in 2006 was when my dad's steel plant, aluminum manganese plant, went on strike. And I had no interest in politics at that time. And I remember going on the picket line with my dad, and Sherrod Brown was there, and he spent the entire day with them, talking to them, learning about their stories, not looking for a media hit or anything like that, not trying to glad hand with donors, but just like genuinely caring about what those people were going through, like my dad. And that really struck a note with me. So I've always really respected him since then. So having him come on our show is a really big deal for me personally.
Yeah, mine's kind of tied. I will say the oddest guest we've ever had, not in terms of them being odd, but just they have no connection to Appalachia, is Steve Hofstetter, who's a comedian who has kind of gotten big off of YouTube. We have no idea why he came on our show, but it was still like the funniest episode. So that's definitely memorable. But for me, it's John Fetterman, who's the lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania. He was one of those guests that we didn't think we'd ever get. And when we got him, it's the only time that I have ever been intimidated asking a question in my entire life.
Well, he's huge, right? He's massive.
He's a big guy. Hey, he can be Big John too, because he's earned it. But that guy he's obviously becoming a big deal in the progressive world. I think he's raised now $1 million for this upcoming Senate race that he's going to be in, and he is a no nonsense, he'll never back down type guy, which is exactly what Chuck and I have been saying that Democrats need in Appalachia for a really long time.
100%.
Was he wearing the same button-up shirt that he always wears?
No, he was wearing the pullover that he always wears with like the neck scarf.
Okay, not the button-up from his formal photo with the American flag.
No. I do think that his office is always on Twitter being talked about. So I do like that too. So
we'll open it up to a few guests from my students, or a few questions from my students, if that's okay.
Sure.
Wonderful. Fire away.
All right, that was easy.
Also,
Thanks.
Maddie Jenkins has raised her hand.
Oh.
Hi there. First of all, thank you guys for coming and talking to us. I've listened to Appodlachia a couple times, and I follow you guys on Twitter, and I like the account a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I guess I was just kind of wondering, I'm always curious about like different barriers that any kind of news or media like production organization faces, whether that's like political or just like, maybe like pushback from the community and stuff. And I was just wondering, like, do you guys ever face anyone kind of like telling you that what you're doing isn't what you should be doing?
Less than you think, because when you talk about two people who tend to lean left, having a podcast that talks about Appalachia, you would think that we would get a lot more kind of hate mail or whatever you want to call it, but it's not that much. But they do tend to be the loudest. They're the people who really enjoy typing in all caps on our Instagram or DMing us that we don't know what we're talking about. But I will say it is far less than what you would think. And honestly, I think personally, if you want to see Appalachians come together, go look at a negative comment on like our Instagram or on our Twitter feed. And I guarantee you there's like 13 replies on why that person is just being a moron. Like you meet a lot of people through this. And I think when people learn to trust what you're saying, or at least they can trust the facts that you're stating, they'll go to bat for you. And I think we see that a lot.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, you can find some really interesting and colorful Apple Podcast reviews from the beginning, many of which we feature on our website prominently. But I think the other thing too that we make a great deal of effort to do is to be factually accurate in the things that we're talking about that involve fact-based statements, and issue corrections when we need to. We rely on valid information resources. We don't go to like Freedom Eagle, grandmapapa.com or something to get like our information. We try to vet it as much as possible. I do a lot of the research for the show, and I want to stake our reputation on that most of the time because we don't want to just be pissing in the wind.
We got a question from Jay McCormick.
Hi. First of all, thank you for coming on. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
All right, great. So my dad works in the House under Hal Rogers, which I think is eastern Kentucky. And my dad's not really a Republican, but kind of has to be right now to keep his job. But says like, yeah, Hal Rogers does really want to do stuff for Appalachia, focuses a lot on opioid abuse and stuff. But then his whole argument is that what happens is, especially under Trump in the last 4 years, that the whole populist narrative is kind of gets in the way of that. And I stalked your guys' Twitter a bit, and I saw a lot of the posts against what's her name, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering what you guys thought about how populist politics can get in the way of actual issues that are plaguing Appalachia, and how to get around that.
Yeah, well, I'd argue that Marjorie Taylor Greene isn't a populist. I think that she's a conspiracy theorist nut job. I don't know that necessarily populism is really the problem. I think that the parties are so polarized in one direction that you can't make independent decisions a lot of times. I mean, if you look at the House of Representatives in Congress, I mean, almost everybody votes uniformly on any major issue there because they're afraid to go against a party because they don't want to get primaried. Populism is an interesting thing because if you use it properly, it can really convey a powerful message. Look what Bernie Sanders did. I mean, look what Trump did to get elected. So I don't know. I mean, I think I'd like to unpack his statement a little more to understand that better. Because to me, like someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene is someone who is an extremist on the very, very far fringes of her party, but that's garnering all the news and media hits because of how extreme and how crazy she is. And that is also, I think, emboldening other people to identify with that. But that will be my take on that.
Yeah, this is not the first time that I've heard this, and it obviously will not be the last. I do somewhat agree that I think the word populist has been redefined to mean conspiracy theories or people who don't actually know at all what they're talking about, but they sound really good when they say it. But really, if you want a good example of like this, I guess, populist candidate who can speak volumes, but also is a little nuts. Richard Ojeda is a really good example of like a populist candidate. He's out of West Virginia. He lost his congressional election, but he ran a really and presidential. That's where the little bit of crazy comes in. But he did run a populist campaign, so you can kind of see an example there. But really, when it comes down to it, you talked about opioids, which always hits hard for me because my dad was an addict when I was growing up, and I don't like when politicians make excuses for not creating legislation that works on opioids, because to me it shouldn't matter if populism is getting in the way or not. That should be a 100-0 vote, in my opinion, in the Senate. That should be really simple stuff. And to me, it's not populism that's really gotten in the way. It's partisanship that's gotten in the way. We now can't look across the aisle. Good example of this, Joe Biden and John McCain. They would bicker for hours and hours and hours and then shake hands afterwards. That doesn't happen anymore. So that's why people don't want the other side to do good things. And I think that's what's really hurting the country.
So y'all are over time now. Can you take one more question from Claire Coles?
Sure.
I was just going to ask who's someone that you guys would really want on the show.
Go ahead, Phil.
Easy one. Tyler Childers. If you don't know him, you should look up his music because it literally speaks everything that we think is very like Appalachian. I guess we can share this. Like, we've reached out to his people. We're hoping that he'll come on. He's very busy, but that is at least my goal for 2021.
Funny story. We tried to get him for the symposium. We had a Paintsville connection. So one of the students is from Paintsville, went to the high school where Tyler Childers went, tried to get him, couldn't quite hook it up this time around. So we're on the same page there.
Well, here, I'll make you a deal. When he comes on the show, first question is, will you be in the 2021 symposium?
Yeah.
It'll be 2022. Sorry, 2022. Maybe he comes, he gives a graduation speech. We set it all up.
Yeah.
Second question is, why didn't he come to this one?
John Walker, do you wanna not to put you on the spot, but John Walker, you want to give some exposition on that, or?
Yeah, so one of his best friends in high school is an assistant coach for the basketball team at the high school that I go to, or that I went to, and so I texted him and I was like, "Hey, make this happen for me." And he was like, "All right, I'll holler at him." And so he texted him and he was like, "No, I won't be able to make it. I've got a lot of stuff going on." So sadly, I couldn't make it happen. So,
but he did text back.
Yeah, texted me back.
That's
so
huge, honestly.
That matters.
Look, our motto is shoot or shoot, right? Exactly. If you're not taking a shot, somebody else is scoring. That's my opinion. So, I mean, hey, keep shooting. Somebody eventually is going to let you have a layup. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, we've been shooting, but we keep getting the rebounds, so we're gonna get in the basket soon with them. Boy, that's a good question. I mean, Tyler Childers definitely is 100% up there. I guess like I'll take the nerdy angle on this and say that I'd love to have John Meacham on. He's a presidential historian from Chattanooga, Tennessee. Currently lives in Nashville. Did speech writing for a bunch of people. Most recently, Joe Biden. Just a really fascinating guy with like an unending knowledge of history and how it impacts current events. And I've read a lot of his books and really been fascinated with him for a long time. So I would say that would be probably high on my list. But honestly, you know, there's probably a lot more people out there at the local level that we really want to talk to as well. I know we've got a couple of different people lined up. We've got I think we can say this, John, because it's been confirmed, right? We've got Charles Booker is going to come on next month. That'll be a really good one. And we've got a lot of other people in the works as well. So yeah, it's going to be a good year. 2021 is going to be a good year for the show.
From the hood to the holler.
Hell yeah.
So I want to give my students they've been on for 2 hours. So I want to give them a 5-minute break. We got Silas House coming at 2:15 talking about someone who'd make a terrific guest for your podcast. So y'all are more than welcome to stick around for him. But I'll give y'all a break until we get Silas. And thank y'all for a terrific. Y'all are very, very good at what you do. I can tell why y'all gravitated toward the podcast platform.
Well, thank you. We appreciate that. And thank you all for having us and for the really good questions. We really do appreciate it. And anytime you need us for anything, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all so much. Unfortunate to jump off here, but glad that we went before Silas because he would be an incredibly hard act to follow.
Super hard. We already had trouble following Nikki. Now we have to, we got to get out of here before Silas gets here because he's going to show us stuff and we don't want to see it.
That's right.
Thank you so much, gentlemen.
Thank you. See ya.
Thank you so much for joining us, Silas.
Hello, thanks for having me.
We're delighted to. Honestly, couldn't choose a better guest to, so this is kind of the end of the semester thing. Couldn't have a better guest to close things out for us. So you ready to get started or?
Sure.
Wonderful. So I'll start with the bio. So Silas House probably doesn't need much of an introduction for a lot of you, but he is a New York Times bestselling author of 6 novels and 1 book of creative nonfiction. His work frequently appears in The Atlantic, The New York Times, and so on. His writing has he is the winner of the Natalis Award, the E.B. White Award, the Intellectual Freedom Prize, Appalachian Book of the Year. I believe he won that twice, and many other honors, including being invited to speak at the Library of Congress in 2016. He is also one of Nashville's most in-demand music writers and has worked with artists such as Casey Musgraves, Tyler Childers, Jason Isbell, Leanne Womack, and many others. Former commentator for NPR's All Things Considered, House is also one of the subjects of the award-winning documentary Hillbilly, now available on Hulu. House is the National Endowment for the Humanities Chair at Berea College and serves on the fiction faculty at the Spalding School of Writing. He is a native of Eastern Kentucky and now lives in Lexington. Thank you so much for joining us. It's such an honor for us to have you here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here and glad to talk about whatever y'all want to talk about. I know that you watched Hillbilly and you read one of my Atlantic pieces, right?
Yeah. So I have a few topics we can get through. I thought a logical place to start out would be Laurel County.
Okay.
Couldn't find a picture of Lily, but here's a photo of Laurel County. So talk about growing up in Laurel County and in particular how that upbringing forged your connection with nature.
Well, I grew up in a really small town. It was only about 500 people. And we lived at the foot of a ridge and sort of I could just roam for acres and acres, you know, and I think one of the main reasons I was outside so much is because my father worked third shift, and yeah, if it was pretty outside, it was much better to be outside than it was in the house because I had to be totally silent until like around 3 o'clock every afternoon. And so if I wasn't at school, if it was summertime, I stayed outside. Um, and I think that it just became a really natural part of my writing. Um, the natural world just always shows up, and I identify really strongly as an environmentalist. Um, at the same time, I grew up in a family of coal miners, and I grew up across the road from a huge coal mine that that destroyed a big part of the ridge where I grew up roaming. Um, and this picture that you're looking at is pretty near where I grew up, actually. That's sort of the headwaters to the Laurel Lake, of what is now Laurel Lake, and I grew up right on Laurel River, so I grew up on the banks of this river. Um, and I mean, I guess it sounds kind of antiquated, but we did take our toys out. Like I had all my Star Wars action figures that I would take out in the creek and things like that. So it was almost like a melding of the world of toys and things like that, and the outdoors. Um, I mean, kids were already playing arcade games and all that, but I just never. I mean, I never really got into when I was little. It was all Atari, and I played that, but I wasn't obsessed with it or anything. I just always preferred to be outside, and I still do. I mean, I just came in from being outside for about an hour of just wandering around the yard and being down by the creek in our yard. It's just who I am, and so it just naturally shows up in my work. And I think I think that being that way makes you more environmentally minded for sure. So it just made sense that I have become part of the environmental movement. Um, And it was also a really religious place to grow up. It was a really oppressive place, very judgmental. You were expected to, be in church, and if you went to church with just about everybody you knew in the community, and if you didn't, you were suspect. And even the people who didn't go to church were pretty steeped in Christianity and also very judgmental Christianity. Now, I do have a strong identity as a Christian. Still, I'm now Episcopalian. But I grew up in a really strict holiness church, very fundamentalist, very evangelical. We weren't, I mean, we weren't supposed to even go to dances or the carnival or football games or anything like that was considered, anything that wasn't to do with the church was a sin, basically. And so I rebelled against that. When I was about 17, I left the church. And for many years, sort of wandered on my own in the wilderness of trying to hold on to my faith, but also find a church that wasn't so judgmental, that wasn't so oppressive. And I managed to find that as an adult, but it took me a long time. And so that's a big part of my identity, is growing up in such a strict church. And the paradox of that is, you grow up around people that love you so deeply, and that love is so thick and so present. It's something that's very much exhibited until you do something that they don't agree with, and then that love is taken away. You're shunned, and that shunning is as thick as the love was. And as a gay teenager, you know, I kept thinking, these people love me so much, but if they know who I really am, they won't love me anymore. And that's really hard to deal with, and it really has a huge effect on your coming out process, of course. Um, and so, if any of you ever read my fiction, one thing that shows up a lot in my fiction is sort of blood family and created family, and the importance of both. And I was brought up to believe that, and I think this is a very Appalachian trait. You you're brought up you're taught that only your blood matters. And, blood is thicker than water is the main thing you hear over and over, and that you must always choose blood. But when you're an outsider, for instance, if you're a member of the LGBT community in a culture like that, you realize that you have to have created family too. You have to have people who will love you for who you are, and not will only love you properly for who they want you to be. And so the idea of created family shows up a lot in my work. Sorry, that's a really long answer.
No, it's great. It's great. I mean, obviously, it's gets a lot into kind of I would imagine your formative years as a writer. So you grew up in Laurel County, but you also had a chance to spend a lot of time in Leslie County, neighboring Leslie County. And from what I've read, Leslie County served as an inspiration for the fictionalized Crow County, which is the setting of your first three novels. So what are some sort of major experiences from Leslie County, and what made it, in your view, a good setting for fiction?
Well, it's deeper Appalachia. It's only 45 minutes from London. I don't know, some of your students have probably been to London, Kentucky. And so it's only 45 minutes east of that. But in that 45 minutes, you're much deeper in the mountains. You're much deeper culturally in Appalachia. And you're much deeper in coal country. And so it's just topographically, it's a more dramatic landscape, and that dramatic topography comes into play really well in a novel, I think. And so that's one reason I used it. Also because it's a smaller, that community was smaller. It was in a way more oppressed. I mean, people go to London, London and Corbin, where I grew up, to go to the big city, when they're from Leslie County. And so, and then people from London go to Lexington, if they want to get to the big city. But anyway, I think one thing is that most of my wild family lived in Leslie County, whereas my church family lived in Laurel County. And so there was this 45-minute space between the really oppressive religious world that I grew up in, and then my family that lived over about an hour east, 45 minutes east. They were party people, and and that shows up a lot in my first book. It's about people who are partying all the time. And of course, that made sense to me to write as a first novel because I was in college at the time. And so I was experiencing a lot of that. I just worked all week, went to college all week, and then we partied all weekend. And so it seemed representative of being in your early 20s in a rural place, for sure. And I guess really it's pretty representative of being in your early 20s, period. And the book is used a lot in college reads, like first year experience reads and books and common things, because I think it has some of those. It's a lot about homesickness, of course, which comes into play as a college freshman as well. But it's really important to me when I'm writing fiction to always have a physical place in mind. And so in the new editions of those books, there's a map. There's a great map that goes with that. You can find it on my website, that shows that fictional county that is really sort of a composite of the 3 or 4 counties that I feel like I grew up in. I grew up in a real tri-county area, and if any of you grew up in a tri-county area, you know that your experience isn't really married to that one county where you went to high school, but it's sort of spread out.
I believe I just looked up Laurel County this morning. I believe it's a dry county, is it not?
It has always been until maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And just about every county in eastern Kentucky was dry until pretty recently. I mean, when I was in high school, it was very common to go to the bootlegger and things like that. And actually, I found that living in a dry county, it was much easier to get alcohol as a young person than it would have been if it had been a wet county, because in a wet county, a liquor store is usually not going to sell to you if you're not of age, whereas a bootlegger just sort of sells to anybody. So that idea of the dry county being better doesn't make much sense to me.
So one of the big themes that we've talked about throughout center term is Appalachia. I mean, you can go all the way back to the local color writers at the time of, the Hatfields and McCoy. It's a region whose story, for so much of its history, has been told by outsiders. What does it mean to be, someone kind of a native Appalachian telling the story of Appalachia and potentially helping to reclaim the narrative? Do you see that as part of your identity as a writer?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, the main thing that's going on there is class, because it wasn't until the 1950s that a working class person actually published a novel about Appalachia. And it was really pretty rare for a working class person to do that up until the 1970s. And it's become much more common as the working classes had more access to college, But I think early Appalachian literature that gave us so many of the stereotypes that are still at play in the media today. Those stereotypes did begin in literature. Even though historically literature has corrected those stereotypes, they did begin in the local color literature. But that's because it was outsiders writing about Appalachian people. For instance, one of the most famous, most widely read accounts of Appalachia in the late 1800s was by Mary Murphy. It's called In the Tennessee Mountains. And it's, just stories of hillbillies and, their crazy ways and things like that. She was actually from a very wealthy family from near Nashville, and her only experience of Appalachian people was when her family would go to the Smoky Mountains to their resort home, and their only encounters with Appalachian people were with the servants they had. And so you can see how that's a really faulty lens to be describing a culture through. When you are the person in power, you're the person who has privilege, and you assign all these stereotypes to the people that are allowing you to make a living as a writer. It's really problematic. And so I think that as an Appalachian writer, you sort of have that responsibility on your shoulders to represent your place complexly. Now, I pause a little bit there because I think sometimes people make the mistake of only wanting to show the place positively. I think if you romanticize a place, it's just as damaging as if you vilify the place. Because to romanticize or to vilify, they're both simplifying, right? And so the only really good truth you can tell about a specific culture is to get to the complexity of the place. So I want to never work in stereotypes, but I also want to show the people as they really are. There are faulted people in Appalachia because they're faulted human beings, and so I think often the way that film especially will show Appalachian people as being faulted because they're Appalachian, not because they're human beings. Does that make sense? Probably the most famous example of that is Deliverance, and I don't know if y'all know about that, but pretty much the Appalachian people are just crazed rapist killers, and there's just no complexity there at all. And so one thing we really tried to do in Hillbilly, the thing I love most about Hillbilly is that the whole story is being told to you by Appalachian people, and that's very rare in film. Even in documentary about Appalachia, usually it will be told from the point of view of a scholar who is not from there, or something like that. And so everybody who speaks, in Hillbilly has an Appalachian experience. They are Appalachian people. The other thing I'm really proud about with Hillbilly is that we wanted to show Appalachia as not being monolithic, because the media, and when I say media, I don't mean journalism. I mean like movies, TV, comic books, commercials, mostly visual media, has a monolithic idea of Appalachia. And what I mean by that is they think that everybody in Appalachia is white, straight, Christian, rural, working class. They don't even think that everybody, they think everybody's poor, et cetera, et cetera. And so in Hillbilly, we really tried to show the wide array of people that lived in Appalachia, and not just one kind of Appalachian. We wanted to show many different kinds of Appalachians. So that's why they're Black Appalachians. There are queer Appalachians. There are liberal Appalachians, conservative Appalachians, academic Appalachians, people who have not graduated high school Appalachians. You know what I mean? Just a wide array of what it means, and lots of different ways of being and ways of belief.
We had a chance to talk to Frank X. Walker a few weeks ago. So when you drive into Danville from Lexington, it says home of Frank X. Walker, poet laureate. But since you brought up Hillbilly, I would imagine for a lot of us, one of the more powerful storylines in Hillbilly is the one with yourself and Jason. And I think Jason has the line, I love Appalachia. Sometimes I wonder if it loves me back. And when Ashley came to film Hillbilly back in Appalachia, there was a ton of politics that intervened. So you could look at, I believe, the same-sex marriage Supreme Court decision happened in 2015. At around the same time, Kim Davis over in Round County became kind of a national figure of the resistance to same-sex marriage. So how did it, specifically as it portrayed yourself and Jason as a same-sex couple in Appalachia, how well do you think it told that story?
Sorry, my dog's barking a little bit back there in the background. He'll hush here in a second. I'm sorry, I didn't get the last part of your question.
How did you feel about how it told the story about your romance with Jason, about your relationship?
Well, that's the thing about, documentary. They filmed that over the course of, I guess it was about 4 years, and you can tell that because I have so many different, my hair, the way my hair is cut changes a dozen times in the movie. But over that 4 years, I mean, they filmed hundreds of hours of us, and so you never know what is going to end up being there. The narrative sort of is in the hands of the director. Even though I was an executive producer on this film, but really the role of the executive producer is I line up people to be interviewed. I line up places for them to be interviewed. I'm like the major support. I'm the person who goes and to task for funding and things like that. I don't have a lot as an executive producer. I didn't have say so in what the narrative ends up being. So with that all said, I really love the way that turned out. And in fact, at one point, the whole movie was going to be about being gay in Appalachia. But as the election became more and more heated, and Appalachian people became more and more used as examples during the election, we realized that the movie had to be more about the election and had to be about those divisions that were starting. And of course, those divisions have gotten much wider since the movie came out. It makes you feel pretty vulnerable. Because, those are the sorts of conversations. We don't pull out our wedding pictures to just show strangers, That's just something you do with friends or family. So it does put you in a pretty vulnerable place, especially as a gay couple. There's been so much hateful stuff written to us since this movie came out, just because we're a married gay couple in the movie. If you look at the reviews on Amazon, there's lots of 1-star reviews. And it's because people see the title Hillbilly, they expect that they're going to watch a movie that is very pro-Trump, for instance, They expect that they're going to see a movie where everybody's conservative, because that's the idea of the hillbilly, right? The hillbilly only has one way of thinking. And so people go to watch this movie and then they hate it because it's not what they want it to be. And so we have received a lot of hate mail for including, a gay couple in the film and showing. It's one thing to show a gay person, but to show a gay couple and who are exhibiting love for one another, that really makes people uncomfortable still. So that going into a movie like that, you're going to get a lot of hate for that. And it's just sort of par for the course, really. If you're in the public eye at all, you got to take the hate with the love. You get lots of both.
So, according to the movie, you were insistent that you and Jason get married in Kentucky, and thankfully you're able to do that. I'm guessing you got married in Madison County. But how did it make you feel at the time to have a few counties over in Rowan have the county clerk Kim Davis almost become the national symbol for homophobia, and have sort of her stand? She was in prison for a few days. She brought in people like Mike Huckabee to Rowan County to rally people against the Supreme Court decision. How did it make you feel being a Kentuckian, being someone insistent on getting married in Kentucky, seeing someone from Kentucky become a national figure for that reason?
Well, that's so complicated because on one hand, let me see how I can articulate this properly. I think the thing is, all over the country, there were county court clerks who refused to marry gay couples. But it's really interesting that the one from Kentucky is the one who becomes the international symbol for this. And I think that's because she played right into all those stereotypes that we have about backward people, right? She was part of a fundamentalist church. She dressed in a particular way. She talked in a particular way. And so she sort of checked off all those boxes that are easily recognizable. They're easy to recognize after your whole life you've been told by media what an Appalachian person is, what a backward person is. Well, Kim Davis was the perfect person to be the symbol for homophobia after marriage equality. And so on one hand, I was so angry with her and frustrated, and of course she's a homophobe. There's no other way to say it. She's a raging homophobe, and she was absolutely in the wrong every way you can look at it, even legally. She's supposed to do her job, no matter what you believe. However, it still kind of miffed me that all over the world she was, being held up as this hillbilly. She's this one individual who became representative of the whole place, And so now people from Moorhead, Rowan County, they constantly, I hear them all the time having to apologize to people for Kim Davis. Well, it's not their fault. That responsibility is only on her. And I think that's what I was talking about earlier. It's always when somebody does something offensive like that in Appalachia, the judgment of the whole country is that it's because they're from Appalachia. Let's say there's a racist attack in Seattle, Washington, right? Not too long ago, there was a black woman who was attacked on the train in Seattle by this white man. When it was reported in the news, it was just that this man, had attacked her. If there's something a racist act that happens in the South or Appalachia, it won't be about the individual. It'll be that they're from the South or Appalachia. And I think that's really problematic because it lets the rest of the country off the hook. It lets the rest of the country sort of have this idea that they're not racist, they're not homophobic or misogynistic or whatever. And it puts all the blame on one group of people. And that's just not true. We know that those sorts of things exist everywhere. In fact, the worst homophobia I've ever experienced was in New York City, where you expect to feel the safest as a gay couple. So I say that just to illustrate that this stuff happens everywhere. And I think that sort of homophobia or racism or misogyny, I think those things happen differently in Appalachia. I think they're louder and in your face, and they tend to be from people you know and love. Whereas when you're in New York City or, other urban areas, they tend to come from strangers. And in a way, when it comes from strangers, there's more violence behind it. It's a little scarier, if that makes sense.
So I don't know how this happened, but we already used up all of your allotted time. Do you have 5 minutes or so to stick around and take questions for my students if they have any?
Sure.
Wonderful.
Sorry.
Any of the dogs are getting very restless. They probably need to be walked. So if you all have any questions for Silas House.
Sorry, the mailman just came and he can see him out the window. So he's gone now.
Pretty charismatic.
Any questions?
Very welcome guest. I think they're all starstruck because they just saw you in a movie.
Well, you'll make me feel boring if you don't ask me questions, so.
Give it another minute or so. So Tim says that I took a few of his. So.
Well, I'll just quickly talk about the Atlantic piece. I think a lot of what I've been talking about is right there in the Atlantic piece, right? It's saying that basically people don't really care about people in rural places. Americans tend to not care as much. We talk a lot about how much we care about rural people and poor people, but when it comes down to really putting that on display, we don't do it as much as we should. When people don't care about natural disasters that happen to rural people, it's because they assume they're all poor people, and it's okay to just not care about poor people. It's the same thing with Hurricane Katrina, right? I mean, there was such a lack of outrage about what was happening to so many people of color during all that. And that's rooted in racism, right? I mean, it is racism. And it's the same way with people don't care about what happened to rural people. It's all classism. It's because everybody's assumed to be poor. And in America, we have this idea that nobody should be poor because we all have equal opportunity and all that. And it's not true. We don't all have equity, and we don't all have equality. And until we all have equity and equality, I think we have a responsibility to speak out on that. We have a responsibility to say there needs to be equity and equality. I mean, personally, I won't rest until, I know that sounds pretty lofty to think that that can ever happen in my lifetime, but I think it's important for all of us to fight in our own ways for everybody to be treated equally, for there to be justice. And I mean, it's this past year, we've seen so many young people doing that. I teach at Berea College, and, in times of real despair, the young people in my life give me so much hope because I see them standing up for justice in these ways. And I think it's really important to point out that there's not just one way to do it. You don't just have to be out marching in the streets. It happened. I think that standing up for equality for people and justice and being a part of social justice, it's just important when you're in a conversation with one other person and they say something really ignorant for you to correct them. That's just as important as being out there marching in the streets, So I think we all have to find our own ways to be of use, and that's what I try to do in my writing. I just want to be to try to elicit change in some way.
We
So
got,
excuse me. So I'll just leave by challenging everybody to do that.
so we got a few questions. So some of
Okay.
the original shyness is worn off. So Ben Harden, you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you for speaking with us today. My question is, what do you think we can do to kind of remove the stigma of against rural people in the United States?
Well, I think the main thing is, you've attended a symposium like this, and now you have real knowledge that other people don't have. I mean, I teach an Appalachian literature class, which is really as much an Appalachian history class as it is about literature, because they have to know the history of the place to understand the literature. And what I tell them on the first day is that my goal as your teacher is that when you leave this class, you'll be able to go out into the world, and when somebody says something really ignorant about rural people or working class people, Appalachian people, you will have real facts to back up your defense of that and to say, no, you're wrong about that, and here's why. For instance, there's this, people will say something like, well, everybody, all country people are all meth heads. And, I saw somebody on Twitter today say that everybody that lived in trailers were meth heads and all that. Well, I grew up in a damn trailer, so that pisses me off, And so, I want to give my students the knowledge to say, no, this is not why there's so much opioid addiction in Appalachia. Here are some of the reasons: because pharmaceutical companies have used us as guinea pigs, because people who are working class and rural tend to have more physical labor that leads to them having issues with their bodies that leads to addiction of pain pills and things like that. I mean, poverty is a part of that cycle into addiction, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think what I'm trying to say is just the more information you have on why these things happen, and being able to, tell people, no, people don't choose these things. There are forces at play that make this happen. I think that's really important, is to be able to change that conversation in that way.
We got one more question from Tim Lever, if you got time to take it.
Sure.
All right. First of all, I want to say thank you for coming. You're kind of an inspiration. I loved you since I saw the documentary at Hillbilly.
Thank you.
But you mentioned in the documentary and in other articles that I've read that you have previously faced this kind of regional shame that comes and goes, not only as a person on the left in a red state, but also as a member of the LGBT. And I very much related to that, as I am a gay man from Kentucky, and I often deal with those kinds of feelings of shame from my own state. So what are some methods that you use to overcome this kind of acquired shame, just for a practical question, I guess?
That's a hard one. I think what I have always done is I fought back through writing, and I think that you just have to find your own way to fight back. For me, it's been art. For a whole lot of people, it's art, having that outlet of art. But there are lots of ways, education, informing others, being of service in whatever way that you can. I think that, the main thing that my parents taught me that has served me so well is to always be of service in any way that I can. And when you're in service to people, they see you as more of a human being than they might otherwise. But I think it's just important to fight back and to not be quiet about it. That's the main thing that people always would say to me as a teenager. They would be like, just don't talk about it. Just be quiet. There's no use in getting everybody riled up about it. Now I say that, and there's some of you out there who just are quiet people who don't have those sort of personalities that want to be in conflict with anybody. And so I don't mean to guilt anybody into that, but I'm saying there are lots of ways, even quiet ways, to make change happen. You can do it. I've done it quietly, and I've done it loudly. So I mean, I guess the thing is just fight back in whatever way you can. And I always think, if I'm fighting back, I'm not fighting back so much for me, but I'm fighting back for the person who isn't able to fight back. And so I think if you think of it that way, it allows you to fight back more, to stand up more if you're fighting for somebody else. Same thing when I talk about class. When I go all over the country and somebody makes fun of my accent, I don't feel so personally insulted as much as I think about my parents and my grandparents and my aunts and uncles and how they shouldn't be negated that way, and that's what causes me to speak out on issues like that.
That response reminds me of one of the tweets of yours I saw the other day. I favorited it and retweeted it. It's never forget that the boy who stuttered beat the bully.
Yeah.
The big message to take out of. So I like the idea of
Right.
There can be quiet forms of resistance as well as blustering ones. I think that's a very
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
very entertaining Twitter account, by the way. I
Thank you.
highly recommend following. So notice you got increasingly more political, kind of toward as 2020 progressed.
Well, I think the thing is it almost seems like it's not even political, right? It's at this point, it's just about decency with some of the stuff that's being said. I think that sometimes we just don't have a choice on that. But at the same time, yeah, you don't want to just be political all the time. You want to have some light every once in a while, right? So finding that balance is hard to do, especially in a dark time. So yeah, well, this seems like a great class. I can tell you have some great students. So
yeah,
I'll hope to see some of y'all in person someday. I was writer in residence at Center last year or the year before last. I was there for 3 days doing all kinds of events. So maybe I'll come back sometime.
Well, I happen to live in Lexington, so hopefully I'll see you at Joella's Hot Chicken, maybe in Ashland Park. I'm interested in getting your take on Joella's Hot Chicken as someone who spent time in Nashville, as to how it. And also, I like the Pinnacles in Berea. I think it's the Pinnacles are part of the reason why it's only been a COVID-10 for me and not a COVID-15. I go and hike them, so hopefully we'll interact at some point. But this is really great. Couldn't think of a better way to cap things off.
Well, thank y'all very much. I appreciate you watching the film and reading some of my work. So y'all take good care.
We'll have to assign more the next time we teach this course.
All right. Holler at me. I'll be glad to talk to them again.
Wonderful.
Take care.